take a good care of her child.
Thank you so much. Even though the text was a mistake, you still decided on helping us.
The fever hit 104.1 at 11:47. Nadia Park watched the number blink on the thermometer like a verdict. Her daughter, Seo-yeon, 3 years old, 26 pounds, the only thing in this world that belonged completely to her, was lying on the couch with a damp cloth on her forehead, making that small, broken sound that wasn't quite crying. The sound that meant she was too exhausted to cry. Too weak. Too hot. Nadia had heard that sound once before, when Seo-yeon was 8 months old and had caught RSV in the middle of January. She had sworn then that she would never let her daughter get that sick again. She had promised it like a religion. Like a debt she owed the universe for the miracle of getting to keep her. And here they were. The apartment was cold. Not because the heat was broken, it worked barely, but because Nadia had spent the last 3 days rationing everything. The electricity, the food, the fear. She worked 6 shifts a week at a Korean-owned dry cleaner on the east side of Chicago, pressing other people's suits and steaming other people's wedding dresses, and every dollar she brought home vanished before she could close her hand around it. Rent, childcare, formula, though Seo-yeon was past formula now, groceries. The credit card she'd been paying the minimum on since Seo-yeon's father walked out of a hospital room 2 years ago and never came back. There was $31 in her checking account. The children's fever reducer she needed, the kind the pediatrician had recommended, the one that worked faster and didn't upset Seo-yeon's stomach, cost $14.99 at the pharmacy 4 blocks away. But she also needed the copay for the emergency clinic if the fever climbed higher. She needed cab fare because the last bus had already run. She needed to be 5 places at once with money she didn't have. She needed help. Her phone screen was cracked along the top right corner. She dropped it in October and hadn't been able to replace it. Some nights she pressed her thumb against the jagged edge without thinking, the small sting of it grounding her when panic started pooling in her chest. Like now. She pulled up her contacts, scrolled past her mother, no. Her mother was in Busan and the time difference made it impossible, and more than that, her mother had already sent everything she could spare twice this year, and Nadia could not make that call again. She scrolled past the dry cleaner's owner, no. Past her only friend in Chicago, Dahlia, who was 3 months behind on her own rent, no. She stopped on a name. Marcus. Seo-yeon's father, the man who had looked at his newborn daughter in the hospital and felt nothing strong enough to make him stay. He had a new number. He'd sent it to her 2 weeks ago in a text that said in case of emergency with a punctuation that felt like guilt rather than care. She had stared at that text for a long time before saving the number. She hadn't used it. She had promised herself she wouldn't. She looked at her daughter. Seo-yeon made that sound again. Nadia typed fast, the way she did everything when she was terrified completely. Marcus, it's Nadia. Seo-yeon has a really high fever, and I need to get medicine and a cab to the clinic if it gets worse. I need $100. I know I said I wouldn't ask you for anything, but this is about her, not me. Please. She hit send. She set the phone down on the coffee table and went back to Seo-yeon, pressed the cloth to her forehead, smoothed her hair back from her face. Her daughter's hair was fine and dark and smelled like baby shampoo even now, even sick, and Nadia pressed her lips to her temple and felt the heat radiating off her skin like something was burning underneath it. Please asterisk, she thought, not to Marcus, not to anyone specific, just out into the dark. Her phone buzzed. She grabbed it. The message wasn't from Marcus. It was from the number she'd just texted, but the response was wrong. The words were wrong. The entire texture of it was wrong in a way that made the air leave her lungs before she'd even finished reading. You have the wrong number, but I read your message. Who is this? Nadia stared at the screen. Wrong number. She had, in her panic in the dark, with shaking hands, she had saved Marcus's number wrong, or called up the wrong contact. She scrolled back through her recent messages trying to understand what she'd done, and there it was. She'd texted a number that was 1 digit off. A stranger's number. She'd sent that message, I need $100, I know I said I wouldn't ask, to a complete stranger. Heat rose in her face, despite the cold apartment. She typed back, "I'm so sorry. Wrong number, please ignore." She found the right contact, sent the same message to Marcus, set the phone down, went to get a fresh cloth from the bathroom. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She was already moving back towards Seo-yeon, the cloth in her hand, and she almost let it go to voicemail. But something, she would think about this later, would turn it over and examine it from every angle, would never fully be able to explain it. Something made her answer. "Hello." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then a man spoke. His voice was low, unhurried, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place, though something in it tugged at her. Korean, she realized. Like the cadence of her mother's oldest neighbors, the ones who had never fully softened their consonants. "You have a sick child." It wasn't a question. Nadia went still in the middle of her own living room. Yes, but I sent that to the wrong number. I'm sorry, I wasn't." "How high is the fever?" She blinked. "I'm sorry." "The fever," a pause, patient, like a man who was accustomed to repeating himself exactly once. "How high?" 104.1. Another silence, shorter this time. "How old?" 3, her throat tightened on the word. "She's 3 years old." "And you need medication tonight, not tomorrow." "Yes, but," she stopped, pressed her fingers to her temple. "I'm sorry, I really don't know who you are. I made a mistake with the number and I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to involve you in this." "I know." The simplicity of it stopped her. "What pharmacy?" he asked. "What?" "The medication. What pharmacy carries it near you?" Nadia looked around her apartment as if the walls might explain what was happening. The couch, the sick child, the cracked phone screen, the $31, the strange, calm voice of a stranger at midnight asking her which pharmacy. "There's a 24-hour CVS on Kedzie," she heard herself say. 4 blocks south. The name of the medication. She told him. He didn't write it down, or if he did, she didn't hear it. There was no scrambling, no asterisk, hold on, let me get a pen asterisk, no background noise of any kind. Just silence, and then his voice again, even and unhurried. "Your address." And here Nadia stopped. She was not reckless. She had never been reckless. She was a woman who had raised a child alone in a city that didn't notice her, who had learned the precise weight of consequences, who did not open her door to strangers and did not give her address to voices on the phone at midnight. "I don't know you," she said. "No. I don't know why you're offering to help." "You didn't ask why." A pause. "You asked for help." Seo-yeon made a sound from the couch, small and tired and hot. Nadia closed her eyes. She gave him her address. The line went dead without a goodbye. No reassurance. No, "I'll be right there," or "don't worry." Just silence and then nothing, and Nadia stood in the middle of her apartment holding her cracked phone and wondering what she'd just done. 40 minutes later, there was a knock at her door. Not a buzzing from downstairs, which meant he'd gotten into the building. She had not let him in. The intercom hadn't sounded. But somehow, without her doing anything at all, there was a knock at her door, 3 measured beats, unhurried, like everything else about him, and when she looked through the peephole, her heart stopped completely. The man standing in the hallway was tall, dark coat. Still, he wasn't shifting his weight or checking his phone or doing any of the small, anxious things people did while they waited. He simply stood, facing her door, as if he had all the time in the world and had already decided how this would go. He was holding a white pharmacy bag. Nadia undid the chain. She opened the door. He looked at her for exactly 1 moment, dark eyes, unhurried, taking in the apartment behind her, the sick child on the couch, the damp cloth, the fear she hadn't been able to fully hide before he held out the bag. "The fever reducer," he said, "and electrolyte formula for after." His voice was the same as on the phone, low, measured. Nadia took the bag. Her fingers brushed the paper, and she noticed distantly that her hands were shaking, and she noticed also that his were not. "Thank you," she said. I can pay you back. It might take me a little while, but I will. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is making a decision about. Not hungry, not predatory, something quieter and more deliberate than either of those things. That is not why I came, he said. And before she could ask what he meant, before she could ask his name, or why he was standing in her hallway at midnight with medication for a child he didn't know, he glanced past her shoulder toward Seo-yeon on the couch. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes did. Give her the first dose, he said. If the fever doesn't drop in 40 minutes, call me. He held out a card, plain white, a phone number, no name. Nadia took it. He turned and walked back down the hallway, his footsteps quiet for a man his size, and she stood in the doorway watching him go until he turned the corner and disappeared. She looked at the card in her hand. She looked at the pharmacy bag. She thought about the building door she had not buzzed open, the intercom that had not sounded, the silence on the phone that had felt less like emptiness and more like control. She thought about the way he had looked at Seo-yeon. Then she went to her daughter, opened the box with hands that had finally stopped shaking, and gave her the first dose. The fever broke at 1:13 in the morning. By then, Nadia had learned one thing she hadn't known before. The wrong number had picked up. And the man on the other end of it was not ordinary. She didn't sleep. Seo-yeon's breathing evened out around 2 in the morning, the fever dropping to a manageable 101, then lower. Nadia sat on the floor beside the couch with her back against the cushions and her daughter's small hand resting in hers, and she watched the clock on the microwave change numbers and thought about the man in the hallway. The card was on the kitchen counter. She had set it there after he left and hadn't touched it since, as if distance from it made it less real. A plain white card, a phone number, no name. She had held it up to the light and found nothing on the back, no watermark, no company logo, just 10 digits printed in clean black ink. She worked at a dry cleaner. She knew fabrics and textures the way some people knew music, and the card stock between her fingers had not been ordinary. It was the kind of thick, matte, expensive paper that didn't bend when you held it. The kind of paper that belonged to someone who never had to explain themselves. She thought about the building door. Their building had a panel intercom at the front entrance. Every visitor had to buzz up, wait, get let in. It was the one security feature their landlord had maintained despite letting everything else deteriorate. The cracked tile in the lobby, the elevator that worked only on alternating days, the mailboxes with broken locks. But the intercom worked. It always worked. It had not sounded. She had not pressed the entry button. And yet, he had knocked on her door on the 4th floor at midnight, as if the building had parted for him. She turned that over and over while her daughter slept. In the morning, she called in sick to work. She could not afford to. She did it anyway. She made oatmeal with honey the way Seo-yeon liked it and sat across from her daughter at the kitchen table and watched her eat with the careful appetite of someone recovering, slow spoonfuls, eyes still glassy but alert, and felt the specific relief of the crisis having passed, not resolved, but survived. "Mama," Seo-yeon said without looking up. "Yes, baby. My head doesn't hurt as much." "I know, that's good." Seo-yeon looked at her. Her eyes were her father's shape but Nadia's color, dark and direct. "Did medicine come?" Nadia paused. "Yes, medicine came." "Who brought it?" "A stranger. A man with a white pharmacy bag and a building key he shouldn't have had. A phone number and no name and eyes that looked at your sick child without flinching." "A neighbor," Nadia said. Seo-yeon accepted this the way 3-year-olds accepted everything, completely, without suspicion, and immediately moving on. She went back to her oatmeal. Nadia looked at the card on the counter. Marcus had never texted back. She went to work the next day. She had to. The dry cleaner was owned by a man named Mr. Cho, who was not unkind but operated on the logic that absence was a character flaw. She pressed slacks and steamed gowns and listened to the machine hiss for 8 hours and told herself she was not thinking about the card. She was thinking about the card. She thought about it on the bus home. She thought about it while she picked up Seo-yeon from the neighbor down the hall, Mrs. Okonkwo, who watched Seo-yeon for $60 a week in cash, which was the only childcare arrangement Nadia had ever been able to afford. She thought about it while she made dinner. Rice and egg, simple and fast, and Seo-yeon ate without complaint because she was already mostly back to herself, chattering about a cartoon she'd watched at Mrs. Okonkwo's. After Seo-yeon was asleep, Nadia stood at the kitchen counter for a long time. Then she picked up the card. She told herself she was only going to say thank you properly. She had said it at the door, but it had been rushed and thin, swallowed by shock and relief. A proper thank you, that was all. She texted the number, "This is Nadia," from the wrong number. "I wanted to say thank you again. My daughter's fever broke, she's okay." She set the phone down, poured a glass of water, drank it standing at the sink. Her phone lit up. "I know." 2 words, she stared at them. She typed, "How do you know?" The pause was longer this time, long enough that she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I checked this morning." Nadia set the glass down on the counter very slowly. He had checked. This morning. Which meant he had a way of knowing. Which meant he had someone watching her building, or someone he could call, or some reach that extended into her quiet East Side block without her knowledge, and apparently without effort. She should have been frightened. She was frightened. But underneath the fear was something she didn't immediately have a name for, a complicated, reluctant feeling that was almost like being seen. She had been invisible for so long. Single mother, low-wage worker, a woman the city moved around without noticing. And this stranger had checked on her daughter's fever the way you checked on something that mattered to you. She didn't know what to do with that. She typed, "Who are you?" This time the pause stretched into minutes. She watched the screen. The little indicator that showed he was typing appeared and then disappeared, then appeared again, then nothing. Then his response. Someone who answered the phone. She looked him up. She was not a detective. She had no particular skills in that direction. But she had a name fragment. She'd heard something when he'd arrived at her door, the faintest sound of his voice downstairs before he knocked, a word spoken to someone she hadn't seen. She wasn't sure she'd heard it correctly, but she typed it into her phone's browser combined with what she knew. Korean man, Chicago, the East Side. The results came back fast. She sat on her couch for a long time afterward. Kang Jae-won, 34 years old, son of the late Kang Do-yeon, who had built what legitimate news sources called a asterisk business empire and what less careful sources called something else entirely. Import and export, hospitality, commercial real estate, 3 restaurants, a logistics company. A name that appeared regularly in the business pages and occasionally, quietly, in crime reporting that always seemed to trail off without resolution, as if the stories ran out of evidence before they ran out of implications. There were photographs, fundraising galas, ribbon cuttings, a charity dinner for a children's hospital. He stood at the edge of every photograph with the same expression, present but unreachable, watching everything with those dark, level eyes. He never looked at the camera directly. He was always looking at something else, something outside the frame, something the photographer hadn't thought to capture. In every image, people around him held a particular posture, shoulders slightly drawn in, chins tilted down, the body language of people who were careful. She found one article from 3 years ago, a journalist who had written a longer piece about organized crime networks in Chicago's Korean business community. The article had been published and then quietly removed from the publication's website. She found a cached version through a secondary link. Kang Jae-won's name appeared twice, both times in connection with the phrase, allegedly coordinates. The article did not name what was allegedly being coordinated. It didn't need to. Nadia put her phone face down on the couch cushion. Her apartment suddenly felt very small. The lock on her door felt very ordinary. The card on her counter felt like something that had changed shape since yesterday, something that looked different now that she understood who had handed it to her. She should stop texting him. She should put the card in a drawer or better, yet throw it away and be grateful her daughter was healthy and forget that any of this had happened. She picked her phone back up, The last message on the screen was still his, someone who answered the phone. She thought about Seo-yeon. She thought about the pharmacy bag. She thought about the fact that he had checked on her daughter this morning without being asked and told her about it without being prompted, with the simplicity of someone who did not need praise for doing what they considered obvious. She thought about Marcus, who still hadn't texted back. She didn't text Kang Jae-won again that night. But she didn't throw the card away either. She saw him 3 days later. She was coming off the bus 2 blocks from home, Seo-yeon on her hip, groceries in her free hand, the particular exhaustion of a Thursday pressing down on her shoulders. The street was ordinary. Corner store lit up orange. A group of teenagers on bikes. A car idling in front of the laundromat. A black car. Long, unmarked, engine running with that nearly silent hum that meant it cost more than her annual salary. She would have walked past it. The window came down. Kang Jae-won was looking at her. Not with urgency, not with the particular intensity of someone who had been waiting. Just with that level, unhurried attention, as if he had simply been there, and now she was also there, and that was all this was. "You walked from the bus stop," he said. "I live 2 blocks away." "I know." His eyes moved to Seo-yeon. Something in his expression shifted barely, like a single degree of temperature change. Almost nothing. Enough. "She looks better." Seo-yeon, who was shy with strangers, looked at him with the unfiltered assessment of a toddler. Then she leaned slightly toward Nadia's neck without looking away from him, in that ambiguous toddler gesture that meant both *I am cautious and I am curious. Kang Jae-won looked back at Seo-yeon. He didn't smile. He didn't perform warmth. He simply met her gaze the way he met everything, directly, without pretense, and something in Seo-yeon seemed to settle, the way children sometimes settle around people who are very still. "You looked me up," he said, not a question. Nadia's jaw tightened. "Yes. And you're still here." "I live here." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Something smaller and more private than that. "I meant you didn't run," he said. Nadia looked at him for a long moment. The car. The tinted windows. The absolute stillness of the man behind them, in a coat that cost more than her rent, on a street that didn't belong to him, watching her with eyes that had already decided something she wasn't aware of yet. "Should I?" she asked. He considered her. The way he'd considered her at her door, that measuring, deliberate look, like he was reading something written small. "Not from me," he said. The window went up. The car pulled away from the curb without hurry, merged into traffic, and was gone. Nadia stood on the sidewalk with her daughter on her hip and her groceries in her hand, and the specific feeling of something beginning. Something she hadn't asked for, hadn't opened the door to, and wasn't sure she could close. She walked home. She didn't throw the card away. The notice appeared under her door on a Friday morning. Nadia almost stepped on it. She was moving fast, the way she moved every weekday morning. Seo-yeon dressed and fed and bag packed, her own lunch made the night before, transit card in her coat pocket, the choreography of a woman who had learned that being 5 minutes late cost money she didn't have. She almost missed it entirely. She picked it up. It was from her landlord, or rather, from the management company that had bought the building 8 months ago, a company called Meridian Property Group, whose letterhead was clean and corporate, and had replaced the handwritten notes from old Mr. Reeves, who had owned the building for 30 years before selling it and moving to Arizona to be near his grandchildren. Mr. Reeves had fixed things slowly, but he had fixed them. Meridian fixed nothing and charged more for the nothing. The notice was a rent increase. Effective in 60 days, a 22% increase. The number sat on the page like something that had fallen from a great height. Nadia read it twice. Then she did the math without wanting to, because the math was the kind that only went one direction. 22% more than what she already couldn't fully afford. She would need to pick up more shifts. She would need to reduce something else, food, maybe, or the $60 to Mrs. Okonkwo, which meant finding different childcare, which meant... "Mama," Seo-yeon was standing in her coat by the door, backpack on, patient in the way of children who had learned to wait. "We're going to be late." Nadia folded the notice, put it in her coat pocket. "I know, baby, let's go." She thought about it all day, pressing other people's clothes and smelling other people's dry-cleaning chemicals and watching the clock. She ran numbers in her head the way you ran your tongue over a broken tooth, compulsively, painfully, unable to stop. She came up with nothing new. The math was the math. On the bus home, she took the notice out and read it again. Then she took out the card. She put both of them on her knee and looked at them side by side and told herself very firmly that they had nothing to do with each other. She put the card back in her pocket. She did not text him. She spent the weekend doing what she always did: laundry at the laundromat on the corner, groceries on a strict budget, Seo-yeon at the small playground 2 streets over where the swings still worked. She applied online to 2 other apartment listings and got no response from either. She picked up an extra Tuesday shift at the dry cleaner and told herself it was enough. On Monday, she came home to find Mrs. Okonkwo's door open and Mrs. Okonkwo herself sitting in the hallway in her reading chair, which she sometimes did in good weather, but never in November. "Mrs. O," Nadia said, shifting Seo-yeon to her other hip. "Is everything all right?" The older woman looked up. Her face was carefully arranged in the way of someone holding something difficult behind it. "They gave me one too," she said. "The notice." 22%. She folded her hands in her lap. "I've been in this building 19 years. Nadia leaned against the doorframe. Down the hall, through the walls, she could hear the sound of another television. The Garcias, probably, or young Devon in 4C who worked nights and slept days. All of them behind their doors. All of them, probably, with the same folded piece of paper in their pockets. "What are you going to do?" Nadia asked. "Don't know yet." Mrs. Okonkwo looked at Seo-yeon and her expression softened by a degree. "Don't know yet, baby. What about you?" Nadia shifted the groceries. "Figure it out." Mrs. Okonkwo made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You always say that." "I always do." But standing in that hallway with her daughter on her hip, and the cold coming through the building's front door that never fully closed, Nadia felt the figure-it-out certainty she usually carried thinned down to something more precarious. She was tired. Not today tired. Something longer than that. She put Seo-yeon to bed at 8 and sat at her kitchen table and opened her laptop and searched for Meridian Property Group. What she found was not what she expected. The company was 18 months old, incorporated in Delaware, operating in Illinois. It had purchased 11 residential buildings in the last year, all of them on the east side, all of them in a band of blocks roughly 8 streets wide. The buildings were all the same type, mid-density, older construction, predominantly working-class tenants, close to a development corridor where the city had recently approved a large mixed-use project. She clicked through to the development project. Commercial space, luxury residences, a planned hotel, the kind of project whose renderings always showed young professionals with coffee cups and no visible financial anxiety. Groundbreaking estimated in 14 months, pending final land acquisition. She sat back. The rent increases were not random. Meridian was pushing people out. Not fast, not violently, but with the slow and legal pressure of numbers that people on her income could not absorb. 60 days at a time, building by building, they were clearing the corridor. Nadia looked up who owned Meridian Property Group. The registered agent was a law firm. She searched the law firm. She found a name attached to an investor profile on a commercial real estate database. Raymond Voss. She didn't know the name. She searched it. Raymond Voss was not Korean mafia. He was not any kind of mafia in any recognizable sense of the word. He was something she thought of as cleaner and then immediately understood was not cleaner at all, just dressed better. He was a developer. Chicago money, old adjacent, the kind of wealth that came with political donors listed and city council members photographed at fundraisers and zoning decisions that seemed to fall like luck, but never actually were. He had a profile in a business magazine from last year. He was quoted saying that urban revitalization required difficult decisions. She closed the laptop. She sat in the quiet of her kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Down the hall, Seo-yeon made a small sleep sound and was silent. Nadia thought about 11 buildings. She thought about Mrs. Okonkwo's 19 years. She thought about the Garcias and Devon in 4C, and all the people behind all the other doors in all the other buildings she hadn't visited but could picture exactly. She thought about Kang Jae-won's car on the street that Thursday. She took out the card. She turned it over, the blank back, the clean white stock. She had told herself she would only text him to say thank you. She had told herself she had no business reaching toward someone whose name appeared next to the word allegedly in articles that disappeared. But she was also sitting in a kitchen where the heat was rationed, doing math that didn't work, looking at the name of a man who was pushing 80 families out of their homes with paperwork and patience, and nobody was writing articles about that. She texted the number. "Are you available to talk?" 3 minutes. She watched the screen. Yes. Her phone rang immediately. "There's a company called Meridian Property Group," she said, without greeting, without preamble, because she had learned something about him in the brief geometry of their interactions, that he did not require social warm-up. That preamble was a kind of softening he neither needed nor expected. "They're buying buildings on the east side and raising rents to push tenants out. I think it connects to a development project. I think the man behind it is named Raymond Voss." Silence. Then, "I know." The 2 words landed, like something heavy set down carefully. Nadia's hand tightened on the phone. "You know." "Yes." "How long have you known?" "Longer than you." She stood up from the table, moved to the window. The street below was ordinary and dark, corner store lights, a few figures on the sidewalk, the same block she'd lived on for 3 years. Then why is it still happening? Because knowing is not the same as stopping. A pause. Not yet. What does that mean? It means, he said, and his voice was the same as always, calm, unhurried, carrying that particular weight of someone who chose every word deliberately, that some things require the right moment, and some things require a reason. She stood at the window. "I'm not asking you to do anything." "I know. I just found this and I didn't know who else." She stopped, pressed her fingers to her forehead. "I don't know why I called you." "You called me," he said, "because you needed someone who would take it seriously." She didn't respond. "Your building is one of 11, he continued. "The others have already lost between 30 and 60% of their original tenants. Yours has held longer. Voss will increase the pressure." "How do you know which building is mine?" A pause, shorter than the others. "I looked," he said. Nadia turned from the window, the kitchen, the card on the table, the notice folded in her coat pocket, the sleeping child down the hall. "When you were on my street last Thursday," she said slowly, "you weren't just passing." He didn't answer. Which was its own answer. "How long have you been watching this building?" she asked. "Watching is not the word I would use." "What word would you use?" A long pause, not evasive, more like a man deciding how much of the truth to give and in what order. "Aware," he said finally. Nadia's stomach turned over once, slowly, not in fear, in the particular vertigo of realizing that the shape of something was much larger than you'd thought, that what you'd assumed was coincidence had edges and weight and intention. He had been aware of her building. He had been aware of Voss. And then a woman from that building had texted him by mistake at midnight, and he had answered, and he had come, and now here they were. "Why?" she asked. "Because Voss took something from me," he said, "before he started taking from you." The refrigerator hummed. The street was quiet. "What did he take?" she asked. Kang Jae-won was silent for 3 full seconds. When he spoke again, his voice was exactly the same, level, measured, but something underneath it had changed. Something had been allowed to show through, briefly, like a light through a crack in a wall. "My father built something," he said. "Voss spent 4 years dismantling it from the inside. He used lawyers and city officials and patience. He was very good at it. A pause. My father died before he saw what was left. Nadia stood still, in the middle of her kitchen. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it. Don't be, his voice sealed again. Be ready. Ready for what? Voss will move faster soon. The development timeline requires it. A brief pause. When he does, he will not stay polite. The call ended. Nadia stood in her quiet kitchen for a long time after. Outside, a car moved slowly down the street below her window. Dark, unhurried. She watched its taillights until they disappeared. She thought about 11 buildings. She thought about Raymond Voss and his difficult decisions. She thought about a man who had been watching her block before she had ever dialed the wrong number, and what it meant that the wrong number had been his. She looked at the card on the table. She was not safe. But she was beginning to understand that she hadn't been safe before him either. The difference was that before, no one had been paying attention. Now someone was. The man appeared at the dry cleaner on a Wednesday. Nadia noticed him before he came inside. She had developed, over years of working alone and coming home late and navigating a city that did not particularly care about her safety, a particular sensitivity to men who lingered. Most people who passed the dry cleaner's window were in motion, transit, errands, the purposeful movement of people going somewhere. This man was not in motion. He stood on the opposite sidewalk for 4 minutes, which she knew because she watched the clock above the pressing machine out of habit, and he looked at the storefront with the specific attention of someone who was not a customer. Then he came in. He was white, mid-40s, thick through the shoulders in the way of someone who had been athletic once and was still carrying the frame of it. He wore a jacket that was too light for November and held nothing in his hands, no dry cleaning, no ticket, no reason to be there. Help you, Nadia said. He looked around the shop, at the racks of plastic-sheathed clothing, at Mr. Cho's office door in the back, closed, at Nadia behind the counter. Nadia Park, he said. Not a question. Something in her chest went very still. Can I help you with something? Just want to talk. He put both hands on the counter. About your building. Meridian sent me. We're doing outreach to residents who might be struggling with the new pricing structure. There are relocation assistance options. I'm not interested, she said. He smiled. It was the smile of a man who had been told no before and had not found it meaningful. You haven't heard the offer. I don't need to. Ms. Park, he leaned forward slightly. The new rate goes into effect in 40 days. We both know the numbers are difficult for someone in your situation. A pause, weighted and deliberate. We can make this very easy. A transition payment, help with first and last month elsewhere. Very reasonable. Someone in my situation, she repeated. Single mother, one income, childcare costs. He said it without cruelty, which was almost worse than cruelty. He said it the way you read facts from a document. We've done our research. He had her file. He knew her income. He knew about Seo-yeon. Her hands were flat on the counter, and she kept them there because she did not want him to see them shake. You need to leave. Ms. Park. This is a place of business and you're not a customer. Her voice was even. She had learned evenness from years of situations that punished anything else. Leave, or I'll call Mr. Cho. He studied her for a moment. Then he straightened, took a business card from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. Meridian Property Group. No name on it, just a number. 40 days, he said. Think about it. He left. Nadia stood behind the counter until she heard the door fully close. Then she picked up the business card and held it and concentrated on breathing until her hands stopped shaking. He had known her name, her situation, her childcare costs. This was not outreach. This was pressure shaped like politeness. She texted Kang Jae-won from the back room during her break. A man from Meridian came to my workplace today. He knew details about me, my income, my daughter. The response came in under a minute. Describe him. She did. Don't take the card with you. Leave it there. She looked at the card in her hand. Why? Because they track who keeps them. She set the card on the shelf beside the cleaning solvent and went back to work and thought about what kind of world she had apparently been living in without knowing it. It escalated within the week. Nothing dramatic, nothing she could point to and say definitively, this is a threat. It was subtler than that. A man sitting in a parked car across from Seo-yeon's daycare for 2 mornings in a row. Not the same man as before, younger, thinner, different jacket, but the same quality of stillness, the same not going anywhere energy. She told herself she was being paranoid. Then Mrs. Okonkwo told her that 2 men had knocked on her door asking questions about the building's tenants, who had lived there longest, whether anyone had organized about the rent increases, whether anyone had been in contact with outside parties. Outside parties. Nadia sat in Mrs. Okonkwo's kitchen and drank the tea she was offered and thought about what outside parties meant to a man like Raymond Voss. She thought about 11 buildings and a development timeline and the particular impatience of money that had been patient long enough. She called Kang Jae-won that night. "They're watching the daycare," she said. No greeting, he didn't require it. A pause. Since when? 2 days. Same car. Different cars, I think. I'm not sure I'm reading this right. She pressed her hand flat on the kitchen table. Tell me if I'm overreacting. You're not. The certainty of it, immediate and unqualified, moved through her like cold water. Not reassuring exactly. More like the bracing clarity of a truth delivered without softening. What does he want? She asked. What men like Voss always want. No resistance, no documentation, no one organized enough to slow the timeline. A pause. You've been asking questions. You found the connection between the buildings. That made you visible. I only looked it up online. That was enough. His voice was level. Voss has people who monitor tenant activity on properties he's acquiring. Public record searches, community board registrations, anything that suggests coordination. A brief pause. You are currently the only tenant across 11 buildings who has connected his name to the project. Nadia absorbed this. How do you know that? Because I have been watching him longer than he has been watching you. She looked at the window. The street below, ordinary and dark. Jae-won, his name in her mouth for the first time, deliberate. She heard the slight shift in his silence. What is he going to do? He will try to remove you without confrontation first. Legal pressure, financial pressure, social pressure. He prefers clean exits. A pause. But if that fails, he becomes less clean. Less clean. He has used other methods on other buildings. His voice remained level, but something beneath it had the particular density of contained anger, the kind that had been compressed for a long time and had not lost any of its mass. A fire in one building, ruled accidental, code violations fabricated in another. A tenant in a third building was assaulted. The charges went nowhere. Nadia's hand gripped the phone. He does this, she said, and nothing happens to him. He does this, Kang Jae-won said, and nothing has happened to him yet. The yet sat in the silence between them, like something with weight. I need you to do something, he said. What? Take Seo-yeon somewhere else for a few days. A friend, family, somewhere not connected to your address. The bottom of her stomach dropped. You think he'll? I think preparation is not the same as prediction. His voice was careful and precise. I think a man who researched your childcare costs is a man who uses what he finds. I think your daughter should not be in that building for the next 72 hours. Why 72 hours specifically? A pause. Because that is how long I need. She wanted to ask what he needed 72 hours for. She didn't ask. She understood, in the way she had been understanding things about him incrementally, through silences, and what he chose to say and what he chose not to say, that some questions had answers she wasn't ready for. She called Dahlia that night, her only friend in Chicago, 3 months behind on rent but fierce and loyal, and the owner of a couch in Pilsen that was always available. She explained only that there was a situation with her building, and she needed a few days off her block. Dahlia said come now if you need to. Nadia said tomorrow morning. She packed a bag for Seo-yeon and a smaller one for herself. She did it methodically, in the way she did everything under pressure. One item at a time, complete focus. No space given to the fear that was trying to crowd in at the edges. In the morning, she took Seo-yeon to Dahlia's. She texted Kang Jae-won from the bus, "We're out." His response, "Good." Then, after a moment, "Don't come back until I tell you." She stared at the message. Seo-yeon was asleep against her shoulder, warm and small, and entirely unaware that her mother was sitting on a bus in November carrying a packed bag because a property developer had researched her childcare costs and a Korean mafia boss had told her to move. She typed, "What are you going to do?" The pause was longer than usual, long enough that she thought he was choosing between several true answers. Then, what I should have done 6 months ago. She found out what happened on the second day. Not from him, from the news. A story on a local Chicago outlet, small but specific. Raymond Voss, founder of Meridian Property Group, was under investigation by the Illinois Attorney General's office for alleged fraud in connection with multiple residential property acquisitions on the city's east side. Documents obtained by investigators suggested systematic misrepresentation in the company's permit applications. 3 city officials had been named in a related inquiry. The story was careful, no accusations, just questions pointed and well documented. By evening, it had been picked up by 2 larger outlets. By morning, Raymond Voss had canceled 3 scheduled meetings, and his lawyer had issued a statement. Nadia sat in Dahlia's living room with her phone in her hand and read the story twice while Seo-yeon played on the floor with Dahlia's cat, entirely content, entirely safe, entirely unaware. She texted Kang Jae-won, "I saw the news." A pause. "I know." She stared at the message. Then, "Was this you?" The pause this time was brief. "I had documentation that needed to reach the right people." She looked at Seo-yeon on the floor, laughing at the cat. She looked at the door of Dahlia's apartment, closed and ordinary and not her door. She thought about the man from Meridian leaning on her counter, about the car outside the daycare, about a fire ruled accidental and a tenant assaulted and charges that went nowhere. She typed, "Can we come home?" His response came immediately, faster than any of the others. "Yes, I'll be outside." He was exactly where he said he would be. The black car was parked directly in front of her building, engine off, which was different from before. Before, the car had always been running, idling, ready, the posture of a man who did not intend to stay. This time the engine was off. He was standing outside it, leaning against the door with his arms loosely crossed, watching the street. He turned when the cab pulled up, not sharply, not with the urgency of someone who had been waiting anxiously. Just turned, the way a compass needle turns naturally, toward a fixed point. Nadia paid the driver, got out, lifted Seo-yeon to her hip, and pulled the bag from the back seat and turned around. They looked at each other across 6 feet of sidewalk. This was the 3rd time she had seen him in person. The first time had been through the peephole, then the open door, the pharmacy bag extended, her whole world in crisis. The second time on the street with Seo-yeon on her hip, his window coming down, the brief and leveled exchange. Both times she had been at a disadvantage, tired, frightened, off balance, the specific disadvantage of a woman managing too much. This time she had slept 2 nights in a row without listening for sounds in the hallway. This time Seo-yeon was healthy and rested and squirming to be put down. This time Nadia had her feet under her. She looked at him properly. He was not what she would have imagined, which was the thought she'd had the first time and was still true. When she'd read his name online and seen the photographs, she'd assembled a version of him in her mind, the gala photographs, the expensive coat, the man at the edge of every frame. That version was correct in its details and wrong in its overall impression. The photographs hadn't caught the stillness, the complete, unperformed quality of his attention. He was not a man who posed, even when he was being photographed. He simply was in whatever space he occupied, with a weight that had nothing to do with his size. "You came outside," she said. "You were coming home." She set Seo-yeon down. Her daughter immediately looked at Kang Jae-won with that same solemn toddler assessment she'd given him before, direct, unhurried processing. Then she looked at the building door and then back at Nadia. "Home," Seo-yeon said. "Home," Nadia confirmed. Seo-yeon walked to the building door and stood beside it with the patient authority of a 3-year-old who had decided the adults were taking too long. Nadia looked at Kang Jae-won. "Thank you for the news story, for whatever you did." "It wasn't enough," he said. She frowned. "The investigation." "We'll slow him." He pushed off the car. "Not stop him. Men like Voss have layers. The investigation touches the outer ones." He paused. "He's already restructuring, moving assets. The buildings will transfer to a secondary entity within the month." The relief she'd been carrying since reading the news story shifted. Not gone, complicated. So nothing changes. Some things change. He was looking at her steadily. He knows someone gave documentation to the AG's office. He doesn't know who yet. When he finds out, a pause, he will respond. "To you." "Yes." She studied his face. "You knew this would happen when you sent the documents." "Yes." "You did it anyway." He looked at her for a long moment. The street moved around them, a woman walking a dog, a delivery truck, the ordinary percussion of a Chicago block, and he stood in the middle of it the way he stood in everything, perfectly still. "Yes," he said. Nadia shifted her bag on her shoulder. "Why?" He didn't answer immediately. She had learned that his pauses were not deflections. They were the opposite, the sign that he was about to say something he meant precisely and was choosing the right words for it. "Because it was right," he said, "and because you were in the way of something that would have hurt you." "And your father," she said quietly. His jaw shifted, almost imperceptibly. "And my father." Seo-yeon made an impatient sound by the door. Nadia looked at her daughter and then back at him. "Come up," she said. "I'll make tea." He looked at her. Something moved across his expression, brief, genuine, almost startled, as if the simplicity of the offer had reached him somewhere he hadn't expected. "Tea," he said. "You can say no." "I'm not saying no." He sat at her kitchen table. It was the most ordinary thing she had watched happen in months, and also the strangest. Kang Jae-won, who existed in parked cars and midnight hallways and the edge of photographs, sitting at her kitchen table in the apartment she'd been slowly losing her grip on, while she filled the kettle and Seo-yeon pulled a crayon set from the shelf in the living room and climbed onto the other chair and began drawing with great seriousness. He watched Seo-yeon. Not intrusively, not performing interest. He simply watched her the way he watched everything, attentively, without agenda. And Seo-yeon, in the way children had of sensing the difference between attention that wanted something and attention that was simply given, did not shy away from it. She pushed a piece of paper across the table toward him without looking up from her own drawing. He looked at the paper, then at the crayons in the middle of the table. He picked up a blue crayon. Nadia's hands stilled on the kettle. She made the tea. She did not say anything about what she'd just seen. She brought 2 cups to the table and sat down and wrapped her hands around her own and looked at the window for a moment before looking at him. "Tell me what comes next," she said. "With Voss." He set the blue crayon down. On the paper in front of him was a careful, precise rectangle. She could not tell what it was meant to be. Seo-yeon leaned over to look at it and appeared to approve. "He'll find out the documents came from me within 2 weeks," Kang Jae-won said. "When he does, he'll move against my business interests first. That's his pattern, financial before anything else. He believes money is the only language that matters. And if the financial doesn't work?" "It won't work," said simply, not arrogantly, just the particular confidence of someone who had built something that knew how to withstand pressure. "Then he escalates," he said. "He'll look for leverage, something to use." His eyes moved to Seo-yeon briefly, back to Nadia. The look lasted less than a second, but it carried everything. She felt it land. "He'll look at who's connected to you," she said. "Yes." "Which includes me now." "Yes." She looked at her cup. You should have considered that before you sent the documents. I did consider it. She looked up. I considered it, he said, and I made arrangements. What arrangements? He folded his hands on the table. There are 2 men outside this building now. There will be at least one on Seo-yeon's daycare block during hours. Your route to work is being monitored. A pause. You won't see them. That's the point. Nadia stared at him. You already did this before you told me. Yes. Without asking me. Would you have said yes? She opened her mouth, closed it. You would have said you didn't want to be in debt to me, he said. You would have said you could manage. You would have meant both things and been wrong about the second one. He picked up his tea. So I didn't ask. She should have been angry. She had the architecture of anger available to her, the feeling of her autonomy having been arranged around without her consent, the familiar frustration of a woman whose choices were made by people who believed they knew better. But she looked at him across her kitchen table, in the apartment with the rationed heat and the cracked phone screen and the notice still folded in her coat pocket, and she thought about the car outside the daycare and the man who had known her childcare costs, and she understood that what he had done was not about knowing better. It was about seeing the danger before she did and moving first. There was a difference. How long? She asked. Until Voss is not in a position to act. A pause. Weeks, maybe less. She nodded slowly. And in the meantime, your business interests take the hit. They've taken hits before. From Voss specifically. A pause. The quality of his silence changed. Jae-won, her voice was quiet. What did he actually take from your father? He looked at his hands. For the first time since she had met him, she saw something in his posture that was not stillness, but its cousin, the held-in quality of old pain, the particular carriage of someone who had learned to carry something heavy without setting it down. My father came to Chicago in 1987, he said. With very little, he built something over 30 years, not clean, I won't tell you it was clean, but it was his. Real estate, restaurants, import trade, a name that meant something in this city. A pause. Voss identified his holdings 12 years ago. He spent 4 years inserting himself. Legitimate partnerships at first. Then he started moving the paperwork. Shell companies, misdirected revenue. By the time my father understood what was happening, 40% of what he'd built had been legally transferred into entities Voss controlled. Nadia said nothing. She let the silence hold what he was telling her. My father died, he said, believing he had failed, that he had been careless, that what he left me was diminished by his own fault. His voice remained even, not broken, sealed, and even the way scar tissue is even. It was not his fault. No, she said softly. Voss does this, he said, legally, patiently. He finds people who built things and he unmakes them from the inside. Your building, your neighbors, my father. He looked up. Different scale, same method. Seo-yeon had stopped drawing. She was looking at Kang Jae-won with those dark, direct eyes, the way children looked at adults who were saying something important in a voice they recognized as sad even when the words weren't. She picked up a red crayon and slid it across the table to him without comment. He looked at the crayon. Something happened to his face. Not a smile, something quieter than a smile, slower, as if the muscles required for it had been unused for a while and were remembering what they were for. He picked up the red crayon. Nadia looked at her daughter and then at the man sitting across from her. The feared name in articles that disappeared, the midnight visitor with a pharmacy bag, the person who had put guards outside her building before she knew she needed them, and felt the particular vertigo of a moment she would remember. Stay for dinner, she said. It's just rice, but stay. He looked at her, not with the measuring quality she'd grown accustomed to. Something different. Something that had less calculation in it and more of whatever lived underneath the calculation, in the part of him that had sat at a stranger's kitchen table and picked up a crayon because a 3-year-old slid one across to him. All right, he said. Just that, all right. And the word was small and plain, and sat in the kitchen air like something neither of them had expected to feel so significant. Outside, the street was dark and ordinary. Somewhere in it, 2 men who she wouldn't see were watching her building. Somewhere in a downtown office, Raymond Voss was restructuring his assets and calculating his next move. Somewhere in the city's legal machinery, an investigation was grinding forward with documents that had Yi-won's fingerprints on them in ways that would eventually become visible. But in here, rice on the stove, a child drawing, a man with a red crayon, and something between 2 people that had started as a wrong number and had quietly, without announcement, become something neither of them could name yet. But both of them could feel. The call came at 6:43 in the morning. Nadia was already awake. She had been awake since 5, lying in the dark listening to the building breathe. The pipes, the elevator, the muffled sounds of neighbors beginning their days, with the specific alertness of someone whose body had decided that rest was a luxury it couldn't justify. Seo-yeon was asleep in the bedroom. The apartment was cold in the way it always was before she turned the heat up, that thin November cold that lived in the corners and along the floor. Her phone lit up, unknown number. Not Yi-won's number, unknown. She answered. "Ms. Park," a man's voice. Smooth, unhurried, the particular ease of someone who was accustomed to initiating conversations and controlling their direction. "I hope I haven't called too early." She sat up. "Who is this?" "Raymond Voss." The name hit her like cold water. She was on her feet before she decided to stand, moving to the window, looking at the street below. Ordinary, dark, the faint movement of early morning. "How did you get this number?" she said. "Ms. Park," a pause, patient and faintly amused. "I've had your number for some time. I've had quite a bit of information about you for some time." Another pause, longer, shaped deliberately. "What concerns me is the information you've apparently been sharing with others." She said nothing. She had learned from Yi-won, without meaning to, that silence was not weakness, that the person who filled silence first gave something away. "You've been in contact with Kang Jae-won," Voss said. "I understand you have a personal connection. That's unfortunate for you. He's a dangerous association, Ms. Park, the kind that creates problems for people who can't afford problems." His voice remained pleasant. "You have a daughter, 3 years old, daycare on Paulina Street." Her blood went cold. "I'm going to suggest," he continued, "that you reconsider some of your recent choices. Take the relocation package. Move somewhere that isn't connected to Kang or his interests. Do this quietly, and I have no reason to make your life complicated." A brief pause. "Do you understand what I'm offering?" She stared at the window, the dark street, the ordinary block. "I understand what you're threatening," she said. A silence. Then Voss laughed, soft, brief, not unkind in its texture but absolutely cold in its intent. "I prefer offer, it's more accurate." A pause. "You have until this afternoon. My associate will be in touch." The call ended. Nadia stood at the window for 3 seconds. Then she called Yi-won. He answered on the first ring. "I know," he said before she could speak. "He called you." "How?" "I've been monitoring his communications since last night. He made the decision to contact you at 2 this morning." His voice was completely level, not rushed, not angry, the absolute calm of a man who had been waiting for exactly this. "What did he say?" She told him, every word as precisely as she could recall it, including the daycare on Paulina Street. The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. She counted them. "Go get Seo-yeon," he said. "Right now, bring her to the kitchen and don't leave her alone today." "Yi-won, I need you to trust me for the next few hours." She was already moving down the hallway. "What are you going to do?" "What I came to do." A pause. "Stay inside. Don't open the door for anyone but me." The call ended. She did not go to work. She called Mr. Cho and said there was a family emergency, which was true in ways she didn't explain, and she sat in her kitchen with Seo-yeon eating cereal and cartoons playing on her phone, and the door locked and the chain on. And she watched the clock and tried not to think too specifically about what monitoring his communications meant, or what I came to do meant, or any of the other things. She had been carefully not examining too closely, because examining them required a kind of reckoning she wasn't sure she was ready for. At 9:15, her phone buzzed. A text from Yi-won. Voss's associate is outside your building. Black jacket, gray scarf. Don't be alarmed, he won't come up. She went to the window and looked down. There, across the street, leaning against the wall of the corner store with a coffee cup he wasn't drinking, black jacket, gray scarf, watching the entrance. She texted back, "There's a man watching my building." "I know. There are also 2 of mine watching him." She looked at the street again, tried to find them. Couldn't. They were invisible to her, which was, she understood, entirely the point. "What happens now?" she typed. His response, "Voss makes a move, then I make mine." She sat back down at the table. Seo-yeon pushed her cereal bowl aside and climbed into Nadia's lap with the unself-conscious weight of a child claiming her territory. And Nadia wrapped both arms around her daughter and pressed her lips to the top of her head and breathed. The morning passed with a particular, suspended quality, like air before a storm. At 11:40, it broke. Not loudly. It never happened loudly, she was learning. The loud version was what people who hadn't dealt with men like Voss imagined. The real version was quieter, more administrative. Her phone showed a notification from her building's management portal Meridian Property Group's tenant system. A message, a formal notice of lease violation, unauthorized subletting, it claimed, a fabricated charge. Grounds for immediate eviction. 60 days had just become 0. She sat at the table and read it and felt, underneath the cold fear, a clarifying anger. The clean, focusing kind. This was his answer to the investigation, to the documents, to her refusal to take the package. He was going to put her on the street with her daughter in November and call it a lease violation, and there would be paperwork to support it that hadn't existed this morning and would exist completely by this afternoon because this was what he did. Legally. Patiently. To people who couldn't absorb it. She forwarded the notice to Yi-won with no message. His response came in 40 seconds. One word. Good. She stared at her phone. Good. He just made a legal move, which means he's documented, which is what I needed. Then, step away from the window. She pulled Seo-yeon off her lap and moved them both to the hallway, away from the window, and she had barely done it when she heard it, not an explosion, nothing like that. A sound from the street. Voices. Then more voices. Then the particular commotion of something happening publicly, unavoidably, in front of witnesses. She waited, her back against the hallway wall. Seo-yeon looked up at her. "Are we playing a game?" Seo-yeon asked. "Yes, baby, a quiet game." "I'm good at quiet games." "I know." Her phone buzzed. A news alert. Then another. A local outlet. Prominent developer Raymond Voss detained for questioning in connection with expanded fraud investigation. Federal involvement confirmed. Then a text from Yi-won. The eviction notice has been logged as evidence of ongoing tenant harassment. It was the 3rd instance in documented sequence. That triggered federal jurisdiction. A pause. Then, he detained himself. We simply made sure the documentation was complete before he moved. She read it twice. He had known Voss would file the fabricated eviction. He had waited for it. He had let her receive it because he needed it on record as the 3rd piece, the piece that moved jurisdiction from state to federal. He had positioned it like a move in a game she hadn't known she was playing, and he had protected her inside it without telling her the shape of the board. She should have been angry about that too. She found she wasn't. Because Seo-yeon was on her hip in the hallway, and the eviction notice was evidence now, and Raymond Voss was being detained, and the man outside in the black jacket and gray scarf had disappeared from the corner, and the building was quiet around her, and her daughter was warm and safe and entirely unharmed. She called Yi-won. He answered immediately. "It's done," she asked. "The immediate threat is done." His voice was the same as always, but she heard something in it now, a quality she recognized from the kitchen 2 nights ago when Seo-yeon had slid a red crayon across the table. A slight loosening. "The federal investigation will take time, but Voss will not be focused on your building while he is managing his own survival." "The other buildings," she said, "the other tenants." Meridian's acquisition activities are frozen pending the investigation. The 11 buildings are included. A pause. It won't reverse the last year, but it stops what's coming. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes briefly. Your business interests, you said he'd move against them. He did. And? A pause. It was managed. Yi-won. It was managed, he said again, quieter, with a finality that told her he was not going to elaborate and also that the cost had been real. That managed was doing a lot of work in that sentence, and she understood it, and he knew she understood it, and neither of them was going to make it bigger than it needed to be right now. She thought about his father. 30 years of building something, the legal unmaking of it, the belief at the end that failure was personal. She thought about what it had cost him to finish what his father never got to. Okay, she said softly. Thank you. Don't thank you. Not for this. His voice was low and careful. This wasn't, I didn't do this for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I know you did it for your father. A pause. Yes. And the tenants. Yes. And me, she said, and Seo-yeon. The pause that followed was longer than the others. Longer than any pause she had heard from him, and she had learned to read his pauses the way you learned to read weather. Yes, he said finally, and you. She stood in her hallway with her daughter on her hip, and the building quiet around her, and the street outside returning to its ordinary rhythms. The corner store, the transit, the city moving forward without drama, and she let that yes be what it was without making it smaller or larger or safer than it was. Come over tonight, she said. I'll cook something real this time, not just rice. She could hear the quiet in him. The particular quality of a man who was not accustomed to being invited into ordinary things and was finding that ordinary things were what he wanted. All right, he said. The same word as before, plain and small and carrying more than it announced. He arrived at 7. Seo-yeon heard the knock first and ran to the door in her socks, sliding on the hallway floor, and Nadia watched from the kitchen doorway as her daughter pulled at the door handle with both hands and looked up at the man standing in the frame. Kang Jae-won looked down at her. He had brought something, a small paper bag. He held it out to Seo-yeon, and she took it with both hands and looked inside with enormous seriousness and pulled out a small stuffed animal, a brown rabbit with long ears, and held it at arm's length to assess it. Then she tucked it under her arm and walked back into the living room, as if this was all entirely expected. Yi-won looked at Nadia. She looked at him. She's 3, Nadia said. She doesn't say thank you yet. She just takes things and moves on. I noticed. The corner of his mouth moved. That small, private near smile she had catalogued. I didn't mind. She stepped back from the doorway to let him in. He came inside. He stood in her hallway for a moment, the coat, the stillness, the absolute quality of his presence that filled a room without demanding it, and looked at the apartment the way he'd looked at it the first night, taking in the details. But different now. Not assessing threat, something more like recognition, like a place he had been before and was returning to. It smells good, he said. Doenjang jjigae, she said. My mother's recipe, I called her this afternoon. Something moved through his expression, brief and real and unguarded. You made jjigae. I figured you probably hadn't had anyone cook for you in a while. He looked at her. What makes you say that? You ate rice and didn't complain. He almost laughed. She heard it, the edge of it, caught and held, and it was the most human sound she had heard from him, and it moved through her chest like something warm and irreversible. They ate at the kitchen table, all 3 of them. Seo-yeon with the rabbit in her lap, eating with the focused appetite of a healthy child, chattering about things that made no narrative sense but were delivered with great conviction. Yi-won listened to her with the same attention he gave everything, complete, unperformed, and answered her questions seriously when she asked them, which made Seo-yeon approve of him in the absolute way of children whose instincts hadn't yet been complicated by experience. After dinner, Nadia put Seo-yeon to bed. She came back to the kitchen to find Yi-won standing at the window, looking at the street. She stood beside him. The city was dark and lit and moving. Ordinary, the corner store, the transit, the block that had been her block for 3 years that had nearly been taken from her, that was still hers. "What happens now?" she asked. Not about Voss, not about the buildings. He turned his head to look at her. She was close enough to see the detail of his face clearly, the precise angles of it, the dark eyes that were always looking at something further than the immediate, the particular gravity of a man who had spent years being careful and was being asked to be something else. "I don't know," he said. The honesty of it was startling. She had not heard him say "I don't know" before. "I know what my life is. I know what it costs the people near me." A pause. "I know that you deserve something safer than what I carry." "You let me decide that," she said quietly. He looked at her. "You've been deciding things ahead of me since the beginning," she said. "Not wrongly, but this one you let me decide." He was still, the absolute stillness. "Then decide," he said. She looked at his face. The man who had come at midnight with medicine, who had sat at her table with a crayon, who had moved invisible pieces across an invisible board to protect her daughter while she didn't know the game was being played, who had carried his father's loss for years and finished it quietly, without announcement, in a way that had protected 80 families and one woman he had met by accident, who had answered the phone. "I'm deciding," she said. She reached up and put her hand against his jaw. Felt the tension in him, not resistance, something more like stillness being held very deliberately, a man who was accustomed to initiating and was choosing not to, giving her the space she'd asked for. She kissed him. He was still for one moment, one breath. Then he kissed her back, and the stillness became something else. Not its opposite, but its completion, the way a held note finally resolves. His hand came up to the back of her head, careful and certain, and the city moved outside the window and Seo-yeon slept down the hall with a brown rabbit tucked under her arm, and the wrong number had led here, to this kitchen, to this man. To this, whatever this was, whatever it was going to be. Dangerous and real and chosen. When they pulled back, he rested his forehead against hers. She felt his breath even out. "I should tell you," he said quietly, "that being near me is not simple. I know. There will be other situations, other men like Voss. I know." "You know," he said, with something that was not quite amusement and not quite wonder, somewhere between them. "I know who you are," she said. "I looked you up. I read the articles that disappeared. I know what allegedly coordinates means, and I know what kind of car that is outside, and I know there are men on this block right now who work for you." She looked at him. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment. "And you're still here," he said. "I answered the phone," she said. "That makes me responsible." He pulled back slightly, looked at her properly. And she saw it then, the thing she had caught in glimpses since the beginning, the thing the photographs had never captured and the articles had never mentioned. Underneath the calm, underneath the control, underneath the years of carrying things alone, a man who had not expected this, who had come to her building for reasons that had nothing to do with her, and had found something he hadn't planned for and had been trying, carefully and quietly, to deserve it. "Stay," she said softly. "Not tonight, I mean," she paused, found the right words. "Don't disappear." He held her gaze. "I'm not a man who disappears," he said. And she believed him, not because she was naive, not because fear had been replaced by something prettier, but because she had watched him, over weeks, in the particular way you watched someone when stakes were real. The pharmacy bag, the red crayon, the 72 hours, the federal jurisdiction, the J-Jiggy going cold while he stood at her window and told her she deserved something safer. She had watched him, and she knew what kind of man he was. The kind who, when he chose someone, chose completely. Outside, the city continued. The investigation would run its course. The 11 buildings would hold. Voss would face consequences that arrived slowly, the way his own methods had legally, patiently, completely. Yi-won's business interests would recover. The men on the block would eventually stand down. Life would continue in all its ordinary difficulty. Bills and transit and Mr. Cho and the cracked phone screen and Seo-yeon growing another inch and needing new shoes. All of it. But also this. A wrong number, dialed in desperation, answered by a man who had no reason to pick up. A child's fever breaking at 1:13 in the morning. A red crayon slid across a table. Rice, then J-Jiggy, then a forehead resting against another forehead in a kitchen in Chicago, while the street outside went about its business, entirely unaware that something had been decided. She had been safest, she thought, from the moment the most dangerous man in the room had noticed her. Not because danger had disappeared, but because now it was on her side.